I'm going to bring you to a kitchen table in rural County Laois. And not this one, but similar to this one, there was myself and a woman called Betty. And there was tea, cakes, couldn't eat the cakes, I'm a celiac, but they smelled amazing. Boxes of newspaper records and photographs, going back decades. And Betty was chatting with me about the book I was writing, Opening a Window on the Past. And I was writing a book on a woman called Lucy Frank. She was the founder of the Irish Country Women's Association, which you would know them by. But the original association was known as the United Irish Women. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it was the United Irish Women of 1798. I went to give a talk in a local village in Carlow about last year, and they cancelled their bingo night thinking they were going to hear about the 1798 women. It was on the United Irish Women of the original Irish Country Women's Association. And at the same time of researching this and chatting to Betty and hearing these stories, I was overwhelmed with the information and the work that the United Irish Women had done. So I returned to do a master's here at Carlow College, and it was on that very topic, the United Irish Women of the South East. At the same time, I was working in the tourism space in a brand new role, which is coined the Just Transition Tourism Activator. And what did that mean? I was working under a scheme, a funded scheme, called Regenerative Tourism and Placemaking. And we were supporting businesses applying for grant funding for developing new tourism ideas. But they had to be regenerative in nature. And at first, I struggled to get my head around that, let alone the businesses and the people who were coming to me. What did regenerative tourism actually mean? And it took a little while, and I went back to my public history roots and my cultural heritage roots and the roots of the United Irish Women. Because as I was writing my thesis, and people were coming to me with ideas for funding for their new tourism projects, they were almost identical. 100 years ago, these women were doing projects like setting up community gardens, and they brought goats over from Wales to set up a goat farm and were making goat's cheese. And I had someone coming to me saying, I'd love to set up a little farm shop and love to keep some goats. There was precedence for it. The work was already happening. This is what regenerative tourism was. It was making tourism that was about the community. It was tourism that was about soil health, about cultural heritage, going back to our roots. And that brings me to this table here. Two of the people who came to me with an idea were PJ and Marion Aylward. And they had a little cottage on their house, but for years they were collecting different things from a closed-down museum and from Perry's distillery in Rathdowney. And I'm sure some of you in the room remember Perry's. And as the distillery closed, they decided to collect all the memorabilia, but didn't know what to do with it. But the one thing that PJ said to me always stuck with me, and he wanted to bring back dancing at the crossroads. And I was like, why aren't you doing it then? You know, and he didn't think there was a demand or a drive for it. And we've just heard Adams talk about the social influencers and social media as a tool for driving cultural heritage. And it's a fantastic way of bringing tourism on. People are now booking their holidays using social media and TikTok, and there's a huge drive and demand. Like Ireland and Irish is one of the most trending hashtags in media for tourism at the moment. But what about the regenerative tourism? Where does that come in? And it really is about tourism that gives back to communities. It's for profit, but it's profit that goes back into regenerating areas, like this country museum. It's social. So teenagers no longer have to leave their communities for jobs. There's jobs in their communities for them. You have social spaces like this. You have tea, your cakes. The ingredients for the cakes come from down the road. And I heard multiples of these stories and these ideas all the way through my job as the tourism activator. There's other places doing it. Places like Botswana. For tour buses arriving in Botswana, and I'm sure any of you who have gone to Dublin or Galway or even down to the Cliffs of Moher for a day see the number of tour buses that arrive daily. Botswana ensured that the tour drivers and the operators give a percentage of their takings back to conservation of their national parks. Costa Rica, one of my favorite. And I come from a social enterprise community development background as well. And in Costa Rica, they have resorts, phenomenal resorts. Like, they definitely don't come to Ireland for the weather, but they do go to Costa Rica. But for the regenerative tourism projects, they have their month's takings or their annual takings visible for people to see. I know any Irish business owner would absolutely cringe at the idea of doing that. But in Costa Rica, what they've found is that if people see that actually the month's takings are a little bit lower and they see the money being reinvested back into the community and employment, their takings are more up. That is regenerative tourism. And more closer to home, in Portugal, they're looking at farm-to-fork initiatives. And we're seeing that more and more and more in Ireland. And what does farm-to-fork mean? It means that when you go to a restaurant, you know that the beef or the vegetables that you're eating came from 20 kilometres away. You know the farmer. They're in your community. That's farm-to-fork, but it's also looking at soil health, looking at how we regenerate the land and use seasonal produce. We're not importing for days on end produce that is just not in season. The traditional narrative of tourism is extractive. It's extractive in nature. And I've been in the industry, and I'm sure anybody else who works in the industry, how many people are we going to get this year? How much income are we going to take in? We know that we get just over 6 billion people to the country every year in tourism, and we know that it generates a significant amount for the economy. But how do we make it less about this and more about this? I don't know if any of you in the room know where this is, but it's one of the most inspirational projects that really drove me on to move into the area of regenerative tourism. It's a place called Abbeyleix Bog. And 26 years ago, this year actually, the community in Abbeyleix blockaded Bord na Móna from going in to extract the peat on that urban bog. It's in the town centre. It's right beside one of the most popular hotels in Abbeyleix. But they said, we've had enough. And there are images from this bog going back to the emergency, so World War II era, of peat piled up. But 25 years ago, the community in Abbeyleix said, we need to stop. We have to stop doing this. This project has now become award-winning. They have re-wetted hectares of bog, and every tree you see there has come back naturally. During COVID, they battled a problem. So it was because it's town centre, it was in the walking route of so many people. And they found that the extra numbers of people walking on the boardwalk, so it really damaged the biodiversity and the wildlife. And I walked down there 2 years ago with my sister from Dublin and my 7-year-old niece, and there was butterflies flying everywhere. There was a lizard ran across. It's not stuff that you would see anywhere else. You'd nearly pay to travel to go see this, and it's on our doorstep. But the reason it's on our doorstep is because that community group said no. We are not being extractive anymore. We're going to conserve. We're going to protect our area. So now, and they do realize that it is a tourism location. They do realize that visitors come. But to become regenerative, they've linked in with a number of universities. And they have researchers come on site. And those researchers look at the peat, they look at the water, they look at the biodiversity. But they've also linked in with a local art college. And the art college have created an annual calendar of paintings, and the funding from that goes back into the conservation of the project. Another example, St. Anne's Park in Dublin, the community markets. It's one of my favourite pictures. People don't come to Ireland for the weather. They most certainly don't say, I'm going to go to this hotel, I'm going to go to this resort. They come for the Irish people. They come for that céad míle fáilte. They come for the island of the thousand welcomes. And that's what you get when you go to an Irish market. I remember as a young child coming up from the Wicklow Mountains to Dublin City, and the first place we'd stop before we go to my grandparents' house was Moore Street, just to get some fresh fruit and vegetables. That is the céad míle fáilte. That is the cultural heritage. That is what makes us the Irishness. This is what people are looking for. And as a historian and a genealogist and someone who works in this community development space, I see a common strand throughout. People want connection. They want to speak to people. They want to engage. It's why people come to Ireland. And I see it day in, day out. They don't come as to stay in a hotel room. They don't come to walk a street by themselves. We were just voted TripAdvisor's #1 place to come as a solo traveller, because they get that engagement, because they find that connection, not because they're by themselves. And this is what more and more tourists are seeking out. And it brings me to Dublin. I'm now the tourism strategy manager for Dublin City. A new team, the Dublin City Council have said, we need to be sustainable. I remember in the interview asking them, do you plan on implementing regenerative tourism? They clearly did if they hired me, because that is the way tourism needs to go. And regenerative tourism is a tourism that gives back to a city. In our strategy, it looks at neighbourhoods. It looks at how communities develop first. It's not extractive, it's complementary. It supports a bottom-up approach to tourism. Communities aren't stakeholders on a spreadsheet. They are informing how tourism happens in their area. I love this picture. When you think of Dublin, and I know I'm in Carlow, and when you think of Dublin, you don't automatically think of Irish culture like this. Yet there's the Murmurs, there's the trad-Irish music. I have not heard more Irish spoken since I have in the last month I've worked in Dublin. It's fantastic, and that is cultural heritage in action. But that's being informed from a bottom-up approach. That's being informed by communities saying, we don't want over-tourism. We want tourism that suits us first and the tourists second. Again, another favourite of mine. And it's Fáilte Ireland, the Irish tourism body, are trying to implement Ireland as the home of Halloween. And we are the home of Halloween. When you think of the Cave of the Cats up in Roscommon and the Irish folklore, and I remember growing up just absolutely obsessed with stories of the Morrigan. That is Irish culture. But it's about how do we blend that Irish culture with our new Irish cultures and our new Irish identities. Everything from early Neolithic times, Bronze Age times, right up to modern Irish times. How do we ensure that we are reflecting our culture and our heritage of everybody on the island of Ireland? And folklore has a common thread amongst so much. So many cultures have folklore that's so similar. There's similar veins, similar stories. And this festival here, the Bram Stoker Festival, it's community-led. Youth theatres get involved, communities get involved. It's booked out every year. You can't get a ticket because it's a community-first approach. And it brings me back to the table. This table is from a museum I visited last week. I've known about it. I've never actually gotten a chance to go in, but I got a chance to go in last week. I don't know if anybody in the room recognises it, but it's from Henrietta House. Henrietta House was a tenement house. And the tour itself it really, as I was planning the ideas and the thoughts for this TED Talk, Henrietta House really got to the heart of what I'm trying to say. For years, so many families, hundreds of people lived in this one tenement house that used to be a house of grandeur, one family living there. And up to the 1970s, the Dublin Corporation at the time, the house was falling down and they were trying to move families into new suburbs. And they struggled. The one thing that everyone who lived on that street came back to say is they were missing their community. They were missing their connection, the people they used to play games with. It was that connection piece is the most important piece that tourists come to Ireland for. It's the one thing that we have in common with cultural heritage. It is our heritage, it is our stories. And we walked into one of the rooms there, and it was recreated and set up from the last tenant who lived there right up to the 1970s. And in it was everything from a Singer sewing machine that I remember sitting in my granny's sitting room to the carbolic soap. I know some of you can smell that in your nose at the moment. And it was that cultural heritage, it just hit me with like a bang. It was like being in my great auntie's house and hearing them, and that is the catalyst for regenerative tourism, and that is what tourists come to look for. So if we want a tourism that becomes sustainable, if we want a tourism that is not going to be over-tourism, if we want a tourism that is better for communities, better for people and better for the planet, we need to look at cultural heritage as the driver for tourism. One last community project. It was called Twinkletown. And I'm sure some of you have been to Christmas markets all over the world, and there was one in Dublin, but it was too expensive for some of the locals. It was just not within their budget. So Dublin City Council as a team came together and devised Twinkletown. It didn't cost more than €5 to go to the Panto. And their numbers rose exponentially because they made tourism about people, about the community, about their stories. It was all about storytelling. It was all about community. And that is how sustainable tourism will grow. I'll leave you with this piece, St. Patrick's Day Parade, one of our biggest cultural events of the year, but one that involves everybody of every community in Ireland. We'll go back. So I'll give you a Céad Míle Fáilte, but I'll leave you with one thought. One of our most famous writers, James Joyce. And I remember studying Joyce in here in the classroom, and Dubliners just rang through to me as a kid coming through to Dublin. And Joyce has always said, I write about Dublin because if I can get to the heart of Dublin City, I can get to the heart of any city in the world. Thank you.